Welcome to the first in a series of journeys to explain something of the landscape of Asby Parish in the county of Cumbria. More grandly, perhaps we're also trying to memorialise parts of this landscape through the telling of stories about lines, marks and place names left upon it by many anonymous generations. What follows is not a quick dash through the centuries. It's deliberately detailed and slow-paced. We hope it will help you make your own slow and detailed engagement with a many-layered landscape. This first screen is to help get a sense of where Asby is. Marked by a yellow pin, we see it in the context of northern England. We'll move a little closer. We're about 5 miles south of the small town of Appleby in Westmorland. In August 2016, the parish of Asby was incorporated into the Yorkshire Dales National Park as part of the Westmorland Dales. Today we're going to fly over part of the parish to look at land that was given by local landowners in the 12th and 13th centuries to the North Yorkshire Abbey of Byland, and which became a grange of that abbey. If you'd like to know more about the history of Byland, check out the links on this website. Research of landscape we're looking at is not complete, so the story will have some gaps, some mistakes and some guesswork. Hopefully, not too many and not too much. On this screen, coloured red is the boundary of Asby Parish, and, within it, boundaries of 3 medieval manors: Asby Winderwath, Asby Coatsford and Asby Little or Little Asby. Although we don't yet know exactly when these 3 manors acquired separate identities. To the west, or at the left of your screen, just below Gaythorne Hall, you can see a limb of land that used to be part of the ancient ecclesiastical parish of Asby until 1935, when it was incorporated in a neighbouring parish of Crosby Ravensworth. Asby's parish church, St. Peter's, a small number of farmsteads and one walled structure, Pickering Close, the name is in yellow at lower left, are shown within and around the parish boundary. Grants of land given to support religious communities, the type of gift we're looking at, were an important feature of the central medieval period. Such grants were made primarily for the purposes of personal and family salvation. Something that's captured in the opening words of one Asby land charter of the period, and I quote, "Know ye that I have given and granted this land for the safety of my soul and the souls of all my ancestors." But, as ever, the concerns of man were not confined to the care of his soul. Granting land to a capable farming order like the Cistercian monks of Byland was also a way for feudal landowners to ensure that areas of land, sometimes quite marginal land, were properly developed, and that leading-edge farming methods, from which other tenants of the lord of the manor could learn, were brought into the locality. Here, in 3 adjacent blocks of colour, we see the estimated extent of land granted to Byland through 2 or possibly 3 actions of the 12th and 13th centuries, with one of them perhaps made even later. The first, involving land coloured pale reddish-brown, took place around 1160 to 1170. The second, land coloured yellow-green, slightly later in the 12th century or early in the 13th, and the third, coloured blue, at what is really an unknown later date. In total, these 3 blocks amount to almost 1,100 statute acres, close to 450 hectares. The land extends over 2 different manors, Asby Coatsford to the north and Little Asby to the south. But, as we noted a moment ago, we don't really know the precise relationship of these manors to each other at the time of the gift of land. It's possible that Asby was still a single manor at that date. One outcome of granting land to Byland was that it connected this Asby landscape not only to a national network of religious houses, but also to a spine of medieval European connections built around the wool trade. This spine ran all the way from large-scale sheep farming in northern England through the Cistercian mother houses to Flanders, and later, from the 14th century, to northern Italy. Connection to this international network also meant that the acres we're looking at were unlike lands surrounding them in one very important way. Instead of being locked into a system of subsistence farming or production for long-established local markets, they were part of an early form of commercial stock rearing for distant markets. In an attempt to estimate the location and extent of the Byland estate, two main pieces of evidence have been used. We've combined these with what we know from other sources about some local landscape features. The first piece of evidence is the names and locations of those fields which were free of tithes in the 19th century. That information is set down in Asby Parish tithe documents, drawn up in the 1840s. Exemption from tithes is probably an indication that the lands making up these fields were once part of a Cistercian estate. From 1221, Cistercian lands were tithe-free when they were in the direct occupation of a monastery, that is, when they were not leased or farmed to tenants. That arrangement continued for lay owners who acquired Cistercian estates after the dissolution. The second piece of evidence is the description of the boundaries of the land given to Byland, as that set out in translations of a charter from the period 1160 to 1170, together with a more general description of lands granted in a slightly later charter. The translations used are by historians Frederick Ragg, John Curwen, and Janet Burton. Just a note of warning here. During our flight, as we move from place to place on Google Earth, you may notice some colour dropout and a little distortion in the names of fields and other features in the landscape. Don't worry, full colour and clarity will return each time we come to a stop. We're going to begin our journey at the northwestern edge of the Byland estate, at a point marked by a blue arrow and star, just below centre screen and above the name label of Asby Grange. We're now at that point, which was marked by a blue arrow in the last screenshot. We're going to trace the abbey lands on the ground, or, if you prefer, from the air. An explanation before we begin about names or labels you see on the screen. Those in yellow are field names from the 19th century tithe documents. You'll see a lot of these as we move around, but not all are part of this story. Field names taken from different sources are in white, and I'll speak about these, if they're relevant, as we go along. I'll mention any of the features labelled in pale blue whenever they play a part in our narrative. The boundary description of land given in the first Byland Charter begins with these words, as Maisongill goes down from the Skers. The first place name almost certainly refers to an area which includes a field still known as Maisongill. That name, in yellow, don't confuse it with the farmstead to the west, its label written in blue, slightly to the left, which now uses the same name. The second place name in the charter, Skers, almost equally certainly refers to a scar or outcrop of limestone, now called Grange Scar. We've flown south of Maisongill to find it. Here it is at the bottom of the screen. You can see beneath the name the colour and shape of the scar or surface limestone. At the northern edge of that limestone, beyond the line of a field wall and two archaeological features labelled in blue, you can see the change in the earth's surface, the depression, where Maisongill, using the words of the charter, begins to go down from the Skers. Let's return north, back to Maisongill. The first part of this name, maison, is nothing to do with the French word for house, and is probably derived from an Old English word, gemara, which means boundary. We cannot be sure when and why Maisongill came to be known by that name. It seems unlikely that it's connected with being on the boundary of the monastic estate, because the field name was probably in use before the 12th century charter granting the land to Byland. It may be linked to the fact that it's on a boundary which at some point in time came to separate manors. The red line marks what at an unknown date became the boundary between the manors of Asby Windowath on the left and Little Asby on the right. We'll move on a little further north, and I'll put more of the translated words of the 12th century charter on the screen. And from the lower head of that gill, this is still referring to Maisongill of course, to the thorn tree standing on the How of Stones, which is on the lower side of Lathgrim, and then in a straight line across to Little Lingwell. How might these words transfer to this Google Earth image? We can't be sure about the location of the How of Stones, but at this period these words were often used to describe surviving Bronze Age burial cairns, dating from a much earlier period of course. So there's some possibility that, if there was a burial cairn here, traces of it may yet come to light. The Old Norse word, spelled Haugr, from which how derives, can mean a hill, a natural height, a heap, an artificial mound, or a burial mound. The name Little Lingwell is probably one that was given to a small so-called Romano-British settlement dating perhaps from around 100 BC to 400 AD, which is located here. It's a top centre in pale blue typescript, close to the apex of a roughly triangular field called Edges. This name, Lingwell, probably derives from ling, that's L-Y-N-G, an Old Norse word for heather, combined with the Old English wall, embankment or wall. So the name Lingwell probably means an embankment or wall, and that was probably the stony remains of the Romano-British settlement, which is overgrown with heather. It's possible that Little Lingwell acquired its diminutive prefix to distinguish it from another nearby, larger Romano-British settlement. Let's assume that the boundary did follow a straight line across to Little Lingwell. You can see that straight line passing through the name Lagrum in white typescript top centre. Lagrum, derived from Lathgrim, the word in the charter, is a field name which has been lost, in the sense that it has not been used for a very long time. You can read here that Lathgrim is derived from an Old Norse word which means track marker. This may have simply referred to a large rock or stone marking what may be an ancient way which runs over this ground. Today that path still links the village of Great Asby to the farms of Grange Hall, Asby Grange, Burtree, and eventually the settlement of Little Asby. For details of the footpath, check out the links on this web page. Over time, as you can see from the text, the minor place name Lathgrim, found in other parts of the north, tended to change to names like Legrums or Legrum. We find our field name, written as Lagrum, L-A-G-R-U-M, in a late 16th century document about a local land dispute. That document clearly places Lagrum in this area, close to the field called Crooks. That name is at lower centre of the screen. So we can be fairly confident about restoring the name Lathgrim, or as we have it here in a later form of Lagrum, to its place in the landscape. We're now going to make a very short flight to the north and slightly east to look at a field called Beecham. It comes into view at centre right. Beecham wasn't part of the larger land grant made during the period from 1160 to 1170, but it does feature under the name Beauchamp in another much smaller grant to Byland, set out in a published undated document, but which is probably from the later 1260s. That smaller grant was made by a Roger Monting or Muting of Asby, one of the older place names for Asby, to the abbots and monks of Byland. Byland was an older name for Byland. The gift made at this date, and you can see on the screen the translated words of the charter, was 5 acres of arable land in a furlong called Beauchamp, between the land of William le Inglis and of Thomas Buith, quit claiming all charges that the abbot and monks have been overstocking the pastures. So it looks as if this was part of the conclusion of a dispute between Monting and Byland, whereby Monting withdrew his allegations about overstocking pastures. Perhaps he made the gift by way of redress to Byland for what may have been an unfounded claim. The pastures referred to are the common grazing which Byland would have had access to through holding land within the medieval manor, access which would have been shared with other tenants like the complainant Roger Monting. This charter document gives insight to tensions that may sometimes have existed between monastic granges and other local farmers. Monting wasn't the only local man who became embroiled during this period in dispute with Byland about its rights of pasture. I mentioned earlier the connections to a commercial network and commercial stock rearing that Byland's Grange brought to Asby in the 12th century. Monting's dispute with Byland anticipates later 17th and early 18th century conflicts about exactly the same point of dispute, overstocking of pastures. We find evidence of these much later disputes in Cumberland and Westmorland manors when the monasteries were long gone, at a time when commercial stock rearing on upland farms had become a core part of a national agricultural market. The description of Beauchamp, or Beecham, in this document as a furlong, the clear reference to arable land, and the description of the 5 acres being located between the lands of others, all point to Beecham being a part, or a furlong as they were called, of open common or town fields of the manor. These open town fields would have been divided into a series of small strip holdings held by tenants of the lord of the manor. We can see from this Google Earth image that Beecham is close to other fields which, to judge from the element flat or flats in their names, also appear to have been part of cultivated common fields. You can see these field names in yellow at the centre and at the left. The names are derived from an Old Norse word, flot, F-L-O-T, but pronounced flot, meaning a level area of ground. This word was adopted into Middle English as flat, and eventually acquired the specific sense of being a division of a large, open, arable field. Incidentally, we can see here that larger Romano-British settlement, now known as Holborn Hill, which we mentioned a few moments ago when looking at Little Lingwell. It's at centre left of the screen, its name in blue. This screenshot of a LiDAR image of part of Beecham, I apologise for the less than marvellous quality, appears to show evidence of field banks and ridge and furrow within the field. These probably indicate a period or periods of ploughing. The origin of the field's name is not known, although a suggestion has been made that it comes from the family name Beauchamp. A family of that name was closely associated with the de Morvilles in Appleby in the 12th century, a time when the de Morvilles had overall control of the manor in Asby. Let's resume our flight eastwards along the boundaries of the land that featured in the earliest charter. After the boundary leaves Little Lingwell at the top left of the screen, the words of that charter tell us it went eastward to the Howe of Stones upon Widcombe Fell. Once again, by combining information about land that was free of tithes in the 19th century With what we know about this landscape from other sources, we can determine the possible line of this boundary. We can be pretty confident that the Charter's words "How of Stones," there in the last line in the text box, refer on this occasion to an identified Bronze Age cairn, now known as Grange Hall Round Cairn. This site is marked just above the centre of the screen, below the text box. You can still see what remains of a mutilated and disturbed round cairn. It's close to where a narrow road which leads from the Asby Mask Road to Asby Grange and Grange Hall, that road is at top centre, forks before it goes on to each of these farmsteads. The words of the Charter also imply that an expanse of land here may once have been known as Widcombe Fell. I've marked this name in white typescript at top left of centre screen, but the name probably applied to a wide area and may have included land on which the farmstead of Fell Head stands today. This is at top right in pale blue. Widcombe, another long disused landscape name, may be derived from the Old Norse personal name Vidkonna. Here is some text about what may once have been Vidkonna's Fell. As I've written, perhaps it's another example of names given to this landscape during Scandinavian settlement of parts of the Upper Eden Valley in the 10th century. We can return this name to a landscape feature to which it may have first been given over 1,000 years ago. Before we move on, let's look south of the round cairn towards two farmsteads, Asby Grange and Grange Hall. Their names are in blue towards bottom centre. Both farmsteads have their name because the land we're travelling over was a grange or outlying farm of Byland Abbey. A monastic grange was worked by lay brothers, generally thought of as the labour force of a religious order, together with paid farm labourers. It would probably have had stock rearing and arable functions. Many Cistercian granges, and Byland, remember, was a Cistercian house, specialised in wool production. Indeed, along with the Premonstratensian and Gilbertine orders, the Cistercians contributed a staggering figure of 50,000 sacks of wool as a contribution to the ransom paid for Richard I. So, in 1193, within 30 years or so of the foundation of the grange here, Asby wool may have been part of a king's ransom. Although this grange was some distance from Byland, it was one of several holdings which the abbey had in the area. Others were at Warcop and Blade Harn. By the 14th century, many monastic granges had been leased. Often this happened because some monasteries, and Byland was one of those, began to suffer a decline in numbers of lay brothers. The Black Death in 1349 diminished numbers still further. Deprived of their principal workforce, the monks reorganised their economy, leasing lands to tenants. The whole of Byland Grange lands in Asby appear to have been leased by the late 15th century, with part perhaps leased by an unknown but earlier date. It may be significant that the earliest parts of the structure of Grange Hall, top centre left, are dated to the 14th century. This may mark a period of rebuilding when lands began to move from monastic to secular possession, although it would also have been a period of Scottish incursions which demanded improved defensive structures. One historian, Frederick Ragg, wrote in 1909, and I quote, "Among the Lowther documents is one of 1477, which shows that the Abbot of Byland leased this grange, except that part which Edmund Scaife already held, to Thomas Scaife, brother of Edmund, for 10 years. 17th century documents in the county archives show that the Scaife family continued to be tenants of the new owners of the Grange farms at that much later 17th century date. Stephen Moorhouse, a landscape historian working mainly in the West Riding of Yorkshire, commented about these two Grange farmsteads, and I'll read my notes from our conversation. It's interesting, he said, that there are two Grange farms at Asby, because Grange management often required two quite separate units of flock management, one for the wethers and one for the ewes and lambs. Wethers, castrated male sheep, were the primary source of wool. Stephen's observations about flock management arrangements may well be the explanation for the existence of two Grange farms, but, alternatively, the explanation may lie in the possibility that one part of this Byland estate was devoted to cattle rearing and the other to sheep. I say this because a number of landscape features south of the two Granges have names associated with cattle: Oxen Moor, Cowdale Slack, Cow Park, Bull Hole, whereas landscape to the north and east, the right of the screen, contains field names which may suggest an association with sheep. We'll look at those in a moment. As an immediate aside about field names, it's worth noting Biggarth in yellow typescript to the right of Asby Grange. The word big in this case does not refer to the size of the enclosure. In medieval times, the word great would have been used to denote size, not big. Rather, as you can see, the name tells of the crop once grown. We mentioned a few moments ago that Granges had arable as well as stock rearing functions, and this field name could date from the period of monastic occupation. It derives from the Old Norse word big, B-Y-G-G, meaning barley. Depending on the type of barley grown, it would have been used either for malting or for a coarse bread flour. If you look closely at this Bing Map's image of Biggarth, you may be able to see there is evidence of ploughing at some time in the past, in the form of ridge and furrow, and, perhaps, a headland formed from soil falling from ploughshares when ploughs were turned. Let's continue eastwards. There's uncertainty about this section of the boundary. We've definitely arrived at those gaps and guesswork I mentioned right at the beginning. The reasons are at least threefold. First, I'm not certain about every detail of the boundaries of land granted in the Charter of 1160 to 1170. That's the area coloured reddish-brown. Second, some of the land here in fields described as being exempt from tithes in the middle of the 19th century may have been land given to Byland in a second charter of the later 12th or early 13th century. They're coloured yellow-green, and more about them in a moment. Third, some land may have been part of another later gift for which we have no documentary evidence. These other lands, coloured here in blue as well as yellow-green, but remember these are my best guesses about their area, were therefore additions to the land granted in the earliest charter, and they extended the boundaries of the Abbey's estate. That earlier charter, and the words are here, states that from the Howe of stones upon Widcombe Fell, that Howe is the Bronze Age burial cairn we've already looked at, the boundary of the land given to the Abbey went to another Howe, thence to a third. Do these words imply there was once a series of Bronze Age burial cairns on this fell, running beyond Grange Hall Round Cairn? Burial cairns were often constructed in groups, and there are 3 close together elsewhere in the parish on Gaythorne Plain. Or were these other Howes natural features? Remember, the Norse root of the word Howe could be used to refer to both burial cairns and natural features. Perhaps there is more evidence of possible cairns to be searched for on the ground. What we do find on the ground here is some evidence of what may be vestiges of a stone and earth bank running eastwards from the cairn towards the present-day dry stone boundary wall of Edges. I have therefore drawn the assumed boundary of the land granted in the earlier charter along the line of that possible vestigial feature. You can follow that from the right of the yellow pin marking the site of the cairn going towards the text box. That field name Edges, top left of your screen, may be derived simply from its position on the boundary, or the edge, of the monastic estate. As you can read on the screen, the translated words of the charter go on to tell us that from the third howe, wherever that was, the boundary of the land given to Byland went unto the ditch, and beyond the ditch eastward the width of 8 perches, that's roughly 44 yards or 40 metres. I haven't been able to accurately determine the location of the ditch, however if this might have been a boundary ditch between areas of manorial land. This speculation arises because a line could have been taken southwards. Remember, we're following the eastern or right-hand boundary of the area coloured pale reddish-brown to reach what eventually became the boundary between the manors of Little Asby and Asby Coatsford. This boundary is near the site of Crosby House, that's centre left, in blue, with a yellow pin marking it. The red line marks the manor boundary. It's possible that the first element of the name, Crosby, is derived from the Old Norse or the Old English word for cross. This may indicate that it was the site of a cross of the kind sometimes erected where roads entered monastic lands. A track, still marked on OS maps as a bridle way, ran from here to what is the present-day road from Great Asby to Solby, meeting it close to the farmstead of Upper Wygill Head. That track may once have been the principal approach road to the Byland Grange site. I've chosen to mark the 1160 to 1170 land grant boundary where I have, that's around the area coloured reddish-brown, simply because beyond the eastern boundary of that area lie fields with the element far in their names. In a moment I'll explain why I think these far fields may have been part of the later 12th century or early 13th century grant of land to Byland. I remain uncertain about the position of that rather precise measurement of 8 perches beyond the ditch eastward, but my hunch is that the long, sinuous eastern boundary of the field called High Pasture, bottom centre left, continued to take the boundary of the Byland estate southwards after it had passed the ditch. Before we follow the possible boundary beyond High Pasture, let's look a little more closely at this block of land coloured yellow-green, all of it described as tithe-free in the mid-19th century. It's an area I believe features in the one later charter that we do have some evidence of. See, within this green block, those far fields I've mentioned. These may have been formed over the years from what began as a single large far field. This name, Farfield, was the subject of speculation by Reverend Canon Thornley, writing in 1899 about field names of Kirkoswald in the former county of Cumberland. He wrote, and you can see his words, "The striking absence of allusion to sheep in the field names raises a suspicion that some of the far lands, so often mentioned as field names, may be grazing grounds of the far, that's with a double R, Norse for sheep. Some of these far lands, Thornley says, are by no means far from the homestead, and are without the companion near field." Thornley's last point about the absence of a near field can also be made about Asby's far fields. Here too, as Thornley puts it, the far fields are without the companion near field. Only, and rather oddly it could be argued, a near far field, which may suggest that the second element in the name far had little to do with distance. Thornley's speculation that the name of Farfield may indicate an association with sheep should be looked at together with another piece of published documentary evidence. That's the late 12th or early 13th century grant of land made to Byland for a specific purpose. You can see an extract from that charter. Historian Janet Burton draws attention to it. Unfortunately, as she points out, the name of the donor is missing from the original folio in the Byland records. The charter refers, as you can see, to land given to Byland to fence and enclose as the monks please. This grant is made for the salvation of the soul of the donor and of all his or her ancestors and heirs. Permission to make a sheepfold above stanner stones for 300 sheep by the long hundred. A long hundred, as you can read here, actually numbered 120. And here, just to the east, are two fields, Stannerstones and Stannerstones Mire. The boundary of Farfield is indeed above Stannerstones, as the words of the charter describe the location of the sheepfold. Let's go back to look again at the words of the charter. What may be in doubt is whether the word translated as fold refers to a single enclosure or building, or to a whole sheep farming operation. Such a larger operation might be seen to be implied in those opening words of the charter, referring, as they do, to lands which the monks are to fence and enclose as they please. At its peak, Byland Abbey had an estimated total flock of between 7,000 and 9,000 sheep. Numbers of sheep kept at Asby are not known, but flock figures for granges of other religious orders in the northwest of England range from 200 to 360. That flock of 300 by the long hundred is at precisely the upper end of this range. The extent of land estimated to feature in this later charter is 135 acres or so, just under 55 hectares, the area coloured yellow-green. Perhaps, according to Tim Cleasby, whose family farmed Grange Hall for nearly 200 years, that's not so far off the acreage required for 360 sheep, with the smaller body size they would have been in the 12th or 13th century. As I mentioned earlier, there could have been a third grant of land, which may have included the whole or part of the fell head fields, the area coloured blue. I suggest they were part of a separate grant or some kind of separate arrangement, because there seems to be a continuous boundary running along the northern side of near Farfield, and then down the eastern edge of that same Farfield. There is one hint of possible earlier inclusion of fellhead fields in the Byland estate, and that an area of these fields may have been part of the Farfield. That hint is found in a Grange Hall estate map, drawn up in 1777. This map names part of a field which is called Browside in the mid-19th century as Farfield. You can see this at the right-hand end of the land coloured blue. On the other hand, there are a number of straight field boundaries in the fellhead fields which look suspiciously modern. I think the most we can say is that this area of land, which is recorded as exempt from tithes in the 19th century, probably became part of another expansion of the Byland estate at some point or points after the early 13th century. We'll go back to pick up the boundary of land which was the subject of that earliest Byland charter. To do this, we're continuing from what I said I was assuming was a sinuous boundary of this land, following the present northeastern wall of high pasture, lower centre left of the screen, and then going around the present-day farmstead of Burtree, before turning more directly towards the south. We're moving on to that farmstead of Burtree. It's labelled pale blue in the centre of the screen. The next part of the description of the boundary in the charter seems to cover a great distance in very few words. A terse instruction, it's in the text box, and so going southward unto the Tarn. Most authorities assume that the Tarn referred to is Sunbegin Tarn, and that seems reasonable. If it's correct, then we have a section of boundary measuring over 3 kilometres, nearly 2 miles, without any reference to other landscape features to help us identify the route taken along the whole of its length. On the face of it, this seems unusual, but there is some evidence for concluding that the boundary did take the line you see on the screen, because the first part of it has tithe-exempt fields on one side, the left, and fields subject to tithes, the oinum fields, bottom centre, on the other side, the right. We'll pause at Bertree to examine the oinums as another example of local field names. The doyen of historians of northwest England, Angus Winchester, tells us, and I quote, "Where a block of fields all bear variants of a common name, as is the case here with our group of oinums, and indeed it was also the case with the far fields we've just looked at, the implication," Winchester continues, "is that they represent subdivisions of what was a larger unit. Very often," he says, "such block names preserve the memory of land farmed communally that has later been enclosed." As you can read, this element, oinum, in the field names is derived from yet another Old Norse word, afnam, which means land newly taken in. We find that root surviving in a number of versions of the field name found in Yorkshire and Cumbria, Enham, Ainham, Yanhams, and so on. You can read them here. These lands were probably an extension of the common arable, the manorial town fields. Land newly taken in for cultivation, as their name implies, perhaps at a time of population growth and increased demand for land, somewhere between, say, the 12th and the early 14th centuries. The national population is thought to have doubled or even tripled during that period. Other portions of manorial town fields, or common arable and meadow, similarly coloured, are at the right-hand edge of the screen. At some point after enclosure of the oinums, that is, when they ceased to be farmed communally within the manor, some of them became part of the land holding of what eventually became the farmstead of Bertree. Within the last 20 years, some of these oinum fields have been cultivated once again by the Boustfield family and have produced decent crops. Perhaps there was some kind of agricultural structure on the Bertree site as long ago as the time of the Byland Grange. Land coloured reddish-brown here was regarded as exempt from tithes in the 19th century, so it was almost certainly once part of the Abbey's medieval landholding. Bertree may have become a separate farmstead at some much later point in, say, the 17th century. The earliest documentary evidence of a resident here appears to be the will of a Thomas Law of Bertree. It dates from 1698. The assumed boundary of the land as we continue southward unto the Tarn passes close to the Dowley tree, a well-known local landscape feature. It's here, its name in blue, at bottom left, located on what was almost certainly open fell in the 12th century, and still is. A tree on this site may once have been a boundary marker in the open landscape, although it seems unusual that the charter makes no mention of a predecessor tree. Today, of course, there's a very new tree here, an oak, planted by the Friends of the Lake District in 2017 within a fine, protecting dry stone bield. Here's some text for you to follow. The name Dowley is generally regarded as a local dialect word which means lonely or desolate. However, historian Nicola White, writing about the Norfolk landscape in the period 1500 to 1800, mentions the word doole, D-O-O-L-E. It's a generic term for boundary marks in Norfolk, but Wright's English Dialect Dictionary, published around 1900, places a very similar word much further north. Wright lists doole, D-O-O-L, also written dole, D-O-L-E, in the north, he says, meaning a boundary mark in an unenclosed field. And remember that the fell here was unenclosed. Is it possible that Dole has morphed into Dowley, and that a tree in this location did acquire its name because it was, in the past, a boundary marker? And so we move on to reach the Tarn. Just east of north of Sunbegin Tarn there's a turbary site, marked in pale blue. The word turbary refers to a tract of land where peat may be dug for fuel. We learn of this particular site in a document dating from 1632. That document lists, as you can see, articles of agreement between inhabitants of Asby Windowath and Asby Coatsforth concerning certain good and lawful, and there's a word missing here in the original, on Kellet and Sunbegin Moor for graving, that's the digging, of peats, turbs, and pulling of ling. This was clearly a formal agreement to establish rules for the gathering of fuel, that's peats, for obtaining thatching or dyke building materials, that's turbs, and for pulling a plant which could serve as fuel or as thatching material or as animal bedding, that was ling, Old Norse for heather, a word we've come across because it was part of the name of the Romano-British site of Little Lingwell. It seems that turf digging continued here for at least another 100 years or so after this agreement of 1632. Nicholson and Byrne recount in their History of Cumberland and Westmorland a story about the skulls of two bowls, horns interlocked, found east of Sunbegin Tarn by people digging for turf around about 1737. We don't know if this place was a turbary site as early as the period of land grants to Byland, but we do know that the abbey was granted, in the 12th century, rights of turbary as well as rights to other resources very like those mentioned in that much later 1632 agreement, which of course had nothing to do with the abbey. The translated words of a charter granting those rights to Byland, dated around 1180, are in the second paragraph of the text box. This charter of Richard de Coatsford tells us that the abbey was to have rights which included access to materials for roofing and thatching of houses and of turbary wherever to be found. After Sunbegin Tarn, the boundary of the land granted to the abbey, the translated words of the charter are here, goes thence to the boundary of land belonging to the hospital, and by that boundary unto Skers, and thence as far as the arable land of Asby extends on that side towards T Bay. Note that reference to hospital. A hospital which probably did hold land in Asby at this period was an institution in York, definitely in existence by the later 11th century, known first as St. Peter's and then, from the 13th century, as St. Leonard's. This great hospital at York, run by Canons Regular of St. Augustine, housed more staff and inmates than any other English medieval hospital. This religious order did not undertake direct management of their lands, like the Cistercians. Their focus was on pastoral care. So St. Leonard's land in Asby would probably have been held as a source of rental income, not as a grange like Byland's estate. Unfortunately, most records of the Westmorland estates of St. Leonard's have been lost. However, John Hill's translation and transcription of a single undated document in volume 7 of his collected papers refers, and I quote, to 16 ox-gangs of land with the tofts, that's the house plots, in Askerby, held by the Hospital of St. Leonard. 16 ox-gangs could have been as much as 320 acres, roughly 130 hectares, a very significant holding. The term oxgang was not only a unit of measurement for arable land, it also included land that was necessary to sustain the ox, meadowland. So it appears, to repeat the words of the Byland Charter, that there was land belonging to the hospital in Asby, and that hospital was St. Peter's, St. Leonard's at York. Yet another document in the Hill Papers, this time dating from 1341, by which time St. Peter's had become St. Leonard's, contains evidence, if Hill's translation is correct, that the same hospital of St. Leonard held at least some part of a group of fields called Haber in Asby. This 1341 document records a transfer of land, 2 acres on Haber, from St. Leonard's to a Robert de Asby. For a moment or two, we'll jump some way to the north along the boundary of the monastic estate to see where fields with the name Haber can be found in this landscape. There's a scattering of them in the middle of the screen. Here's something on likely sources of this field name. It probably derives from an Old English or an Old Norse word meaning hay. That word has been combined with either the Old English bjorg, meaning hill or mound, or the Old Norse berg, meaning hill or mountain. Therefore, this place is probably a hill where hay is grown. It's meadowland, a category covered by that word, oxgang. These Haber fields are within what was, almost certainly, a large block of common manorial meadow and arable land. Other fields you can see, particularly those with land in their name, were probably arable in medieval times. Was this the land belonging to the hospital, or at least part of it, mentioned in the Charter? My estimate of the block of manorial town field, common arable and meadow, which lay here, is at least 250 acres, just over 100 hectares, definitely comparable to the 16 oxgangs in that undated document among the Hill Papers. If this is so, how should we interpret and understand the words of the Byland Charter? Now that we've established where the hospital lands may have been, and where our boundary may be heading, let's go back to the Tarn and consider the translated words of the Charter. Thence to the boundary of that land belonging to the hospital, and by that boundary unto Skers, and thence as far as the arable land of Asby extends on that side towards T-Bay. At first reading, it sounds as if the line of travel should go first to the boundary of the hospital land before it goes on to Skers, or Grange Scar as it's called now. However, it's most unlikely that any kind of cultivated or meadowland, which the word oxgang usually refers to, would have been located in the kind of terrain we find between Sunbegin Tarn and Grange Scar. Those of you who've walked here will be in no doubt about that. Instead, if translations of the Charter are correct, the word by in the phrase "and by that boundary" in this context might be rendered as "in the general direction of." So, adopting this sense of the word by, we might understand the Charter to be saying something along the lines of "and going in the general direction of the boundary of the hospital land, we come first to the Skers, and then go on to the arable land of Asby." That land is probably that area which includes those fields called Haber. This seems to be quite a good fit with the picture we see on the ground. To show the line of the boundary on this image, I've assumed that it went north from Sunbegin Tarn to follow first the line of the boundary between Asby manorial land and the manor of Orton. You can see that name at far centre left. The manor boundary is the red line running up from the tarn. It passes what is almost certainly an old boundary marker stone, the Mitchell stone, centre left. That name probably derived from Mickle or Big Stone, before it climbs Kinmond to go on to the Skers or Grange Scar. A further assumption I've made as we fly northwards is that the boundary also followed what became a boundary between the manors of Little Asby and Asby Winderwath, even if it wasn't yet functioning as a manor boundary at the time of the Charter. So, after following the Orton manorial boundary beyond the clints and grikes of the limestone of Lowsey Brow, it turned west to reach that second boundary. That's the one between Little Asby and Asby Winderwath. You can see that junction more or less at centre screen. The Little Asby Winderwath boundary continues across Oxenmoor, another name of a landscape feature no longer in use. We find it in 17th century records of riding the boundaries of Asby Winderwath Manor. If you walk this area today, you'll see the line of the boundary marked by a post and wire fence. Those who know this area will be aware that all the land coloured reddish-brown up as far as field boundaries around the blue archaeological features at top centre right is still common, unenclosed grazing. I'm not sure how this area, which includes Grange Scar, became separated from the rest of the land which made up the 12th century gift to Byland, unless it somehow remained common. The rest of the land remained attached to the two Grange farmsteads, and some, eventually, also became part of the farmstead of Burtree. There's evidence that local folk memory connecting land around Grange Scar to these three farms survived until later years of the 19th century. This can be found in a letter written to the then owner of Grange Hall, a Mr. Wakefield of Kendal, in 1877. This was a time when there were quite advanced proposals to enclose Little Asby Common, of which Grange Scar is part. The writer of the letter is Lord Lonsdale's steward. He mentions a meeting with the Assistant Enclosure Commissioner, where the Commissioner had asked, and I've put the words of the steward's letter on the screen, whether that part of the waste called Grange Scar belonged exclusively to three farms, viz. Asby Grange, Grange Hall and Burtree, or whether it was waste of the manor, that means common grazing, and subject to be dealt with like the rest of the common. The steward's letter continues, I have looked into Lord Lonsdale's title, and I find no evidence that this land is other than waste of the manor of Asby, and I should be glad to know whether you intend to raise any objection to it being dealt with accordingly. He concludes by pointing out that the owners of the other two farms, Asby Grange and Burtree, are willing that it should be treated as part of the common. As the boundary of Abbey land continues north, it passes along the foot of a dry stone wall between two fields called High Ground and High Pasture. High Pasture you'll see at top centre left. High Ground is a very large field, taking up almost the whole of the right-hand side of the screen. High Ground is described as exempt from tithes in 19th century parish documents. But a field immediately to the north of it, called Low Pasture, now coming into view at top right of the screen, is not included in that list of exemptions. Therefore, I've assumed that the boundary of the Abbey land followed the line of what became the Little Asby Winderwath manor boundary and excluded Low Pasture. It turned east to follow the northern boundary of High Ground. That change of direction of the red line of the manor boundary is in the centre of your screen. Now we find ourselves coming back to landscape of the kind described in the final words of that charter of 1160 to 1170, and thence as far as the arable land of Asby extends on that side towards T Bay. This instruction also brings us back to our starting point, where in the opening words of the charter Gill goes down from the Skers. For here we are once again at Gill, lower right, the boundary gill as we have learned it to be. At first sight, the description in the charter of this arable land we've reached as extending towards T Bay appears curious. T Bay, located some miles to the southwest, seems a strangely distant point of reference. But I think T Bay may have been chosen because it's possible to trace on a modern Ordnance Survey map what may be the route of an ancient trackway which leaves the southern end of Dixon's Haber, that's towards top left of the screen, above School Land. To go south, first to the hamlet of Sunbegin, from where it follows narrow metalled roads to Raisbeck, then continues across country, before it becomes once again a footpath which leads into T Bay. We'll end with a flight to another possible outlier of Byland Abbey's land, an outlier similar to Beecham, which we visited much earlier. This is a field called Abbot Bottom. Here it is at left centre, close to the Sandlands. It's a field name which could be derived from the surname Abbot, the name perhaps of a one-time tenant or owner, but it could also, of course, be derived from the monastic title of abbot, and may indicate that this field, or part of it, was once held by Byland Abbey. A Westmorland historian we've already mentioned, the Reverend Ragg, wrote about an undated charter, and you can see its words here, which granted to the monks of Byland 1 acre of land above Great Haber, lying between the land which Robert, son of Durand, gave the church of the Blessed Peter in Asby, and the land of the same monks of Byland. This document, and its reference to Great Haber, may offer evidence that there were abbey lands quite close to Abbot Bottom, for here, once again, we see Haber fields, scattered amongst the pepperlands, to the right of the screen. However, given that we've also been able, with some confidence, to locate lands of the Hospital of St. Leonard in this very same area, the abbot element in this field name might just as likely be derived from an association with St. Leonard's in York as an association with Byland. But disentangling that will have to wait for another journey, because we've now reached the end of this one. We hope you've enjoyed this flight over part of the whole landscape of Asby, telling of its links to the Cistercians of Byland. We hope too that this flight may have helped you to understand a little more of the earth beneath, and as you walk the fields and fells, you'll remember those people who have worked, shaped, and named this landscape. Thank you very much for watching. We look forward to you joining future flights to hear more of this landscape, just one of a myriad, many-layered corners of the Westmorland Dales.